saw stuff like food and soap and medicine produced at a massive scale like never seen before, and more products in stores meant that suddenly companies had to put a lot more effort into finding ways to distinguish their goods from those of their competitors. Coming up with a mascot for a product or brand was one way that they figured they could do that. So you could say that the earliest product mascots were just the guys who invented the thing that was being sold, who would often put a picture of their face on the side of the package. Back in the Victorian age, after all, a stern, bearded male face was an important symbol of credibility and authority at a time when only important people would get their portrait done. So having a guy like this on your bottle of aftershave or whatever was an important way to signal to consumers that some serious person was lending his credibility to what the customer was buying. The earliest fictitious corporate mascots operated on a similar principle. They were often just portraits of some broad ethnic stereotype who was considered trustworthy in some way. So for example, some sort of packaged food product might have a grinning black person on it because black people were considered good cooks. Native Americans were good at marketing anything that wanted to project a natural vibe. A Dutch guy could sell stuff associated with being handy, while a friendly, backwards Quaker man became the face of what was even back then a pretty old-fashioned American breakfast of boiled oats. Many of these mascots from this era are of course terribly problematic by today's standards, but at the time, they represented an important advertising innovation in the sense of using a lovable, made-up character to make a product seem more attractive to consumers. But you know what's even more lovable than a creepy racist caricature? A cartoon. So cartoons, as we know them today, which is to say simplistic and stylized humorous drawings, are an example of one of the many new styles of art that emerged around the dawn of the 20th century. Though satirical art has obviously been with us for a very long time, if you have ever seen comic strips or political cartoons from the 19th century or before, you will know that these were usually drawn in a pretty realistic style, with people and things depicted in a fairly straightforward, representational sort of way. But the early 20th century saw artists beginning to experiment with all sorts of imaginative new styles of drawing and painting that eschewed the importance of strict representation. Styles like Impressionism and Abstraction and Cubism. And it didn't take long before cartoonists started incorporating some of these stylistic conventions into their work as well. The dawn of animation in the 1910s was a very big deal too. Making animated short films was initially a very complicated and very labor-intensive process, requiring hundreds and hundreds of pages of hand-drawn pictures just to produce a few seconds of motion. And the way a lot of artists worked around these challenges was by only making animations with very simple-looking characters that would be easy to repeatedly draw. And as it turned out, audiences really loved the cute look of these simple characters. And very quickly, a style that was initially just a matter of practicality became a beloved aesthetic in its own right. An aesthetic so beloved, in fact, that it could soon be harnessed to sell stuff. That said, some of the first efforts at creating cartoon character mascots for American brands in the 1910s and 20s were kind of grotesque and weird looking, like Mr. Peanut or the Campbell Soup Kids or the Wrigley Spearman. And this basically reflected the fact that drawing in the cartoon style was still something that a lot of artists were struggling to master. But customers responded very well to these early efforts to give brands cartoon mascots, even to the point of considering them to be the equivalent of the real cartoon characters that they saw at the movies and in the papers. And just as the big animation companies like Disney capitalized on the popularity of their characters to sell dolls and toys and things, so too did the major brands of the early 20th century successfully sell quite a bit of merch based around their characters too. A practice, of course, that continues well into the present day. But it was really not until the 1950s that American cartoon mascots truly entered a golden age. And why the 1950s, you ask? Well, there were a few big reasons. One, by the 1950s, American cartoonists had just gotten a lot better at what they did. Disney and Warner Brothers had been at it for over 30 years at that point, having established what we would now recognize as the iconic American cartoon style. Cartooning and animation had accordingly just become a much more popular and well-defined craft than it had been a generation earlier. Second, America enjoyed a huge economic boom after the Second World War, and this saw an equally huge boom in the number of brands and products available for Americans to buy, and even more brands and products meant an opportunity for even more corporate mascots. Third, the rising wealth of American families also meant that children exerted more influence on American spending habits than ever before, which meant that companies became much more eager to make products that children would beg their parents to buy, which meant an increase in using child-friendly gimmicks in packaging and advertisements, child-friendly gimmicks like cartoon characters. And fourth, and most important, television was invented around this time, which triggered a huge new burst of interest in animation, partially for making new animated TV shows, but also for making animated commercials. Now, a lot of animated TV commercials in the immediate post-war era featured pretty low-budget animation, even by the standards of the time. But it didn't matter just because the characters that the companies were coming up with by this point were so compelling. Forget lamos like those Campbell soup fatties. The 1950s and 60s saw the emergence of some of the most iconic corporate mascots of all time, like Tony the Tiger, the Trix Rabbit, the Pillsbury Doughboy, and of course, Mr. Bubble. By this point, a lot of these characters were getting pretty abstract in terms of their connection to the product that they were pitching, but one of the big innovations of this era was that it didn't really seem to matter. Who cares if a toucan had nothing to do with breakfast cereal? The kids loved him. Some of the major brands of the time even specifically solicited some of America's top animators to come up with winning cartoon mascots for them. Jay Ward, who was the mind behind the very popular Rocky and Bullwinkle TV show, for instance, was also the guy who designed one of the most iconic corporate mascots in the American cultural canon, Captain Crunch. Things also worked in the opposite direction. The guy who designed the Chiquita Banana Lady for the United Fruit Company would go on to draw two of America's most popular comic strips, Hi and Lois and Hagar the Horrible. As the decades progressed, corporate mascots became such a successful technique for building brand identity and loyalty that pretty much any big company selling anything got into the racket. There were fast food mascots, hotel mascots, pill mascots, battery mascots, and even most controversially of all, cigarette mascots. Joe Camel, the official spokesperson of Camel cigarettes, who was introduced to America in 1988, was the source of a bit of a moral panic for a time, because he pretty obviously existed to make smoking seem cool to kids, or at least teens. But the idea that mascots are sort of uniquely sinister and manipulative in the way that they capture the imaginations of children is actually a pretty old anxiety. Like, I'm sure you've heard somebody somewhere make reference to some study that said that more children can, recognize Ronald McDonald than Jesus Christ or something along those lines. But even this is a pretty stale trope. For instance, when I was doing the research for this video, I read a thing that was describing how in the 1940s, parents were all in a tizzy because some survey had shown that kids could more easily recognize Elsie the Borden milk cow than Santa Claus. But the fact that a disproportionate number of the corporate mascots in existence today exist primarily to sell junk food to children has provoked a growing backlash in these health-conscious times of ours. The government of Chile and several Mexican states in recent years have banned the use of cartoon mascots on food packaging, creating these rather unsettlingly empty cereal boxes. And check out this picture I found on Reddit. A guy was at the American import store somewhere in Mexico, and they had to tape over the leprechaun on the Lucky Charms box in order to legally sell it. It doesn't seem that unimaginable that this sort of thing could come to America itself someday, with the Kool-Aid Man one day being as loathed as Willie, the Cool Cigarettes penguin. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, I was personally a huge fan of mascots as a kid, and they had a big influence on my technique as an artist. But what is interesting is that if I had to say which mascots impacted me the most, a lot of them were actually pretty hyper-local things that I grew to love largely because I saw them so often in my neighborhood, rather than because they were objectively good. So for example, I remember Lil JJ doing a lot of fan art of Tilly, the Tiletown Tile Man, or Mr. Lube, the mascot of the local oil change place, or the Beaver from Beaver Lumber, which I am actually selling a parody t-shirt of, if you're interested in buying something that obscure. And maybe it is just my childhood nostalgia talking, but to this day,